All right, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The webinar is about preparing for the unknowns in 2023. My name is Mathijs Slangen. I'm Vice President for Sales and Marketing for Flexport in Europe here at Flexport. As with all of our webinars, we always start with a brief legal note. So please keep in mind that all the information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend to reach out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation here. Also, some more housekeeping items. On your screen here, we're using this great tool to actually facilitate the webinar. On your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. And if at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. Right. Also, you can ask questions via the Q&A tab on the sidebar. We really would welcome you to ask questions so that we can have a nice, engaging webinar, and we will make sure to answer the questions at the final part of this webinar. You can download a copy of the slides in the main menu above the screen, and we will drop also a link in the chat at the end of the presentation. Right, and you will receive the slides and the recording of today's webinar tomorrow. So, after the legal and the housekeeping items, I'm very happy that I'm not alone here today. So I'm actually super enthusiastic that Willem Obermann is joining me today. He's partner at Monitor Deloitte, and he serves as the transport, hospitality, and services leader in the Netherlands and the strategic transformation leader in EMEA. Willem, thank you very much for joining here. Maybe you could introduce yourself a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Mathijs. I think you covered already the main part of the introduction as I've written it down, but and indeed everything is correct what you said. So I'm a partner indeed in Deloitte, specifically in Monitor Deloitte, which is the strategy arm of the Deloitte firm. Indeed, transportation leader, and kind of my focus is helping companies deliver strategic transformation. So really making strategic change happen. So no paper exercises, but really lasting change. So that's a bit my intro, Mathijs.
Yeah, no, great. And obviously fits very well with the topic that we're going to discuss today. So I'm very happy that you're willing to share your insights and expertise on those topics as well with me and with the rest of the audience. So the idea is that you and I are going to make it a little bit of an interactive webinar where we will discuss topics on that we believe are relevant for managing unpredictability. So now, maybe to start, why this webinar, right? So why is this an important topic, or why do we think that this is relevant right now? So firstly, our industry continues to be extremely unpredictable, right? A lot of the things that we see happening right now, if you talk to a lot of stakeholders and participants in our industry, would say like, hey, who would have guessed that the rates would be at the level that they are right now? Who would have predicted that? And actually, a year ago, we would say the same thing, but then the other way around, right? So who would predict that the rates would be at this level where they were at that time? So the volatility and unpredictability in our industry continues to be very, very high. I was once at a conference, and I can't remember who mentioned it, but one analyst, I think, was speaking, and he says like, hey, there's actually two types of forecast. The first one is lucky, and the other one is wrong. Right, and I think like it's obviously meant as a little bit of a joke that time, but there is some element of truth in there, right? So there is a lot of different elements that are actually making specifically our industry extremely unpredictable, and we just need to face that. We need to live with that because we don't expect that to change anytime soon. So we will discuss today how can you manage, how can you deal with this unpredictability, and what can you do to actually make sure that you're well prepared for that going forward. We will do that by looking at a couple of topics, a couple of themes. So firstly, we will look at, okay, so what is the current state? Where are we right now in our industry? And what are those elements that are actually influencing those decisions and scenarios going forward? Then we say, like, once we know what the current state is and what the elements are that are actually influencing that, let's look at the what if scenarios. What are the specific scenarios that you should or could take into account? Once we have identified those scenarios and look at that, then we look at, okay, so how do I respond to this? Is a rapid response required? What does a rapid response actually entail? And how do I balance that against, controlling cost? And then finally, we will wrap this up with, okay, now going forward, what can I do with those scenarios? How can I build a case internally to make sure that my organization is better prepared for the unpredictability that will certainly continue in our market? So that's the agenda for today. Again, very excited to discuss that. Let's start with the first topic of the current state, which is a little bit the why of where we are right now. And we typically see 4 elements right now that are influencing or making our industry, the supply chain industry, very unpredictable. On the one hand, the economic outlook, right? So needless to say, there's a lot of things going on right now in our markets. There's high levels of inflation. There is different measures that are taken to see if we can limit the inflation a little bit. That has different levels of effect on the markets. We also see that GDPR differs quite massively, or the GDP actually differs quite drastically per market. So there's a lot of different elements in the current economic outlook that are, actually not that rosy, or at least also very unpredictable right now. So that's the first part. And Willem, I will ask you in a second what you actually think of this current economic outlook. So please brush up your crystal ball there. Then the second part is we actually moved in our industry from a seller's market into a buyer's market. Those who have the goods, those who have the cargo right now, are actually more in control than, let's say, a year ago, when it was those who have the capacity, or the ships or the planes, are the ones who are in control. So it's a complete shift from seller's market to buyer's market, and obviously requires different response strategies. Then the next part is the geopolitical tensions, right? So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of unfortunate political conflicts going on in the world, and trade wars, etc., cyber attacks, and all kinds of geopolitical tensions that are influencing not only us as a society, but also our global trade and the supply chains. And then the final part that we also want to discuss here is that we are facing different levels of recovery and different types of recovery, right? Dependent on the market, dependent on the industry, dependent on the mode. We see that some markets are a little bit less touched by it, and you see that the recovery is actually pretty gradual. In some cases, you see very acute responses and then followed by a drop again, so a little bit more volatile. You see more U-shaped recovery. So there's all different types of recovery taking place in our market, and it's important to make sure that you understand those different scenarios as well, I would say. Hey, maybe on this one, let's start. Before I ask you, Willem, about these ones, let's start with a quick poll. Right. So for the audience here, it's always very interesting to have a little bit of an interaction going on. So if we look at those challenges that we also just mentioned, right, or where do you currently see the biggest challenge that can influence your supply chain, right? So we have a couple of options mentioned on the screen. So please feel free to give us your answer, and then we will see the bars populating where your answers are on this poll. But the first one will be like, hey, I'm not worried. And as we see it right now, there's a lot of people, or there's not a lot of people who are actually not worried, which makes sense, because the different uncertainties that we just mentioned are very real. On the other hand, unforeseen supply chain bottlenecks, that's currently a smaller part of you that is considering that to be the biggest issue, which makes sense, right? Because the buyer's market, as explained yet, is taking away a couple of those bottlenecks. Um, the worsening economic uncertainty is by far the biggest challenge that we see right now, followed by that increased geopolitical tension. So I think very much in line with what we anticipated that to be. Although I would expect that the distribution to be a little bit more equal. But given the fact that the current economic outlook is the one that is worrying most, Willem, what's your take on this? What's your 6 to 12 months outlook, or let's say thoughts on what will happen there?
Yeah, I would say the outlook is very weak when it comes to growth. The signals for inflation that it's reducing are good, but will take kind of a long period before it really goes back to the levels that we want to have. And if you look at the other factors that you have, is that you have a situation where we actually need less demand to combat inflation, in combination with inventory that is still out there that needs to be sold. And then we have also, because we have so many pandemic disruptions, we also see that in the pandemic we had a boom for demand for a lot of goods, and now we see kind of a shift from goods to services, as you can only own so many game computers, etc. And now you have the opportunity to be out again. So you have a sort of combination of that. A lot of purchases were already made. People are now more shifting to services, and that's driving also kind of weaker demand for goods, hence also less trade flows. And I would say another effect has been we had sort of decades long tailwind also of reducing trade tariffs. So we saw from 1986 to 2019, we saw the tariffs decline from 14 to 4%. So that tailwind is also kind of, well, you cannot go much lower. So that tailwind is also gone when you look at the global trade factor. And
All right,
if I may add towards this page, yeah, Mathijs, sorry for
yeah, please.
so one of the elements that is not covered on this slide, but I think will have important mid long term implications for the how you set up the supply chain is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, plus also the Green Deal. And important within the European Green Deal is also the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's always a mouthful, but that means that sort of products outside of the European Union will be taxed based on how much carbon was emitted for that, to create a level playing field for producers in Europe versus outside of Europe. And both the Inflation Reduction Act plus this Green Deal will be big drivers of reshoring. And based on kind of research we did, we saw that in the short term by 2025, there's an expectation that 20% will already take actions on Asia originating freight, and by 2030 that will be 40%. And the expectation was that this mostly impacts agricultural, apparel, and consumer electronics. So
Okay.
I'll probably stop talking now, otherwise we run out of our script.
No, but it's that's a lot of information, which is very good, and thank you for adding on to this. But I guess it's safe to say, and I think you explained it in a very proper way, that the economic uncertainty, which is one of the biggest challenges and concerns also of this audience, is definitely one which is very valid and that we should be concerned about. If I also listen to that, like to the different measures that you mentioned, and also the
Yeah,
impact of trade tariffs and Green
yeah.
Deal, etc.
Well, and you and if you and you need to unpack it because suppose the economy grows with like 0.5%, but that's sort of the total across services and the physical sector. Then kind of if services grows 2%, and then that means the other economic sectors are shrinking. So you need to kind of decompose what's happening to the growth to actually get to the number that drives businesses that have a physical supply chain.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So uh, that's even making this exaggerating this, I would say,
Yeah,
right, or
yeah,
making it bigger. All right. I think we set the scene. I think we've given enough the let's say uncertainties that we
yeah.
need to take into account, and this is I think it's a good summary. So that's nice. So
Yeah,
how to
maybe
then?
maybe you should do a poll where everybody's now twice as scared as when they started.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That would be an interesting option indeed. Yes. All right. Hey, so now how to plan for the unpredictability. So I want to share a little bit about the approach that we took here, or what we're looking at. So the idea is, well, these uncertainties are definitely there, right? And the need to respond to these risks is extremely important. So what is the approach here that we think is extremely interesting and also good to focus on? One, identify those global driving forces. That's also what we just discussed. So what are those different elements that are actually impacting our supply chain? Then the second part is do an inventory on those levels of uncertainty, right? So what and how uncertain do we think that the scenario, that the probability of those different scenarios is? What is the level of uncertainty that we see there? Then, once we have established that, it's like, okay, let's look at the ability, but also the need to actually respond to these uncertainties. For some of the elements, it could be for your product, your company, or your industry that is not really required to respond to it in a very fast way. And then you define your strategic supply chain choices around it, and you take action there. I think that's a little bit of summary of how we want to look at scenario thinking. Now, Willem, you're talking a lot to customers when you're talking about strategic transformation. How important is scenario thinking in your approach, or is this something that you take into account? What's your take on this?
Yeah. Scenario thinking is really important, and traditionally you would do linear forecast plus or minus 10%. There you go, and that is really not cutting it. So kind of how we normally approach this is really it's almost mostly in line, fortunately, with what you said. But it's
Luckily.
really around kind of defining the critical uncertainties that have the biggest impact on your business. And the phase after that is really important. It is quote unquote develop the stories for what could happen. And basically, what you're doing is you're combining a couple of these critical uncertainties that have a certain relationship to each other. You combine that and you create one scenario uh, that is kind of valid. And you take then that scenario to look at how should I respond as a business in that scenario. And you have then sort of multiple scenarios that you then kind of already define your responses to. And that helps you if you look at really the short term, like short term scenarios. It helps you to act really fast because you already know what you would like to do in a certain situation. And the longer term scenarios, there you really make the decisions of sort of how do I set up my supply chain, where do I have the manufacturing, etc. And that are the long term scenarios. And it's important to make this data driven. Um, and we use all kinds of tooling to uncover sort of what are the fundamental uncertainties for a client. And we have also tooling to track the critical um, indicators whether a certain scenario would be true or become more likely. So you identify what are the indicators, you track them, and then you get a sort of notification if the chances that this scenario might unfold have rapidly significantly increased, then you know that you need to do already more preparation for that. So it's still called scenario thinking, but it's quite different than how this was done in the past. So this is nowadays much more data driven than we were able to do in the past.
Interesting. Especially that last part is so you're actually saying this story is important to what if, right?
Yeah,
So you look at the scenarios and then you make sure that you have that story, like short term,
yeah,
long term
yeah,
implications or actions,
yeah,
data,
yeah,
and then the tooling. And the tooling is also I come up with scenarios. I assess more or less what the probability is, but then I'm also going to track if the scenarios are going to actually
yeah,
materialize or not.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
And for
Yeah.
if you look more at the short term scenarios, right, that is kind of what we kind of define as what you actually want to go to. I have to do my colleagues justice, otherwise I'll use the wrong name. But it's kind of and it's a buzzword with all these AI pieces. So it's something one of the four pillars of the future of supply chain as we define it, and it's about autonomous supply chain, which you really have kind of the real-time visibility to also enable sort of automated decision making based on certain parameters that you set. And this is really something for the kind of more the tactical events that happen. So you have
Yeah.
but in all of these cases, when you kind of define response to scenario, really the data on your as is, kind of how your goods flow, where they come from, is crucial.
Definitely. Okay, that's good insights, and we'll come back on that data element in a second as well. But
Yeah,
it's good also to hear that from a scenario thinking perspective. There's also more data and more tech actually used to make it make it even better.
yeah,
Thank you for that. Okay, so let's dive into a few of those scenarios. So what we also do also in combination with our customers, obviously we look at what are the specific scenarios that we should take into account. And what we've done here is we're naming a few of those scenarios, and then we're also looking at the potential implication on that. And to your point, Willem, the majority of this is short term, to be honest, right? So how do I prepare for things that will happen in the upcoming months, right? So it's a little bit less about that those long term ones, and we divided them into two groups: gradual ones, and then more the unforeseen events. And we started with those gradual ones, also where we're discussing to customers and to other industry experts. And we've come up with a few, right? I mean, I won't go over all of them here right now, but you can read them, and then we can also see the potential implication of those for, let's say, everyone in who's acting in the supply chain, but specifically also the customer with whom we are discussing this. So maybe I'll take out two. So let's assume that our rate and demand will remain low, right? Which means that the current freight rates are at a very low level because we see that the demand is not as large as the capacity that we see out there in the market. If this happens, if we believe that demand will continue to stay weak and the rates will also continue to be low, then on the one hand, what you will see is that internal financial pressures will obviously rise. Less demand means I get less revenue in, right? My warehouses are full, as Willem also mentioned. I have a lot of inventory. That inventory is all, that's working capital that it's stuck in my inventory, and that's causing issues. And like your CFO or other financial stakeholder will definitely then like increase the pressure on how to handle with this or how to deal with this from a supply chain perspective. So the internal financial pressure will definitely rise if the demand remains low. Obviously, there's then a tendency, or it's very important that or what the good thing is that those rates are then on a very low level. So it's very tempting to then actually accept those very low rates. Last but not least, the pool of, let's say, business, the demand pool is getting smaller and smaller. So our customers need to fight also more for winning those customers. So the competition will increase, and you will see more aggressive survival kind of tactics being used in the market. And we see that in, let's say, the logistics market as well, right? So different types of strategies and aggressive plans are actually rolled out. So that makes it very, very difficult to also understand where the market sits. Another one that I want to highlight here is the cost of raw materials, for instance, staying high and being very scarce, right? So that actually, the implication of that is that resource planning is even more important than it was before, right? So you have to make sure that all of the resources that you have, the raw materials, are used in the most efficient and productive way. Extremely important. Um, and on the other hand, there will be also more emphasis, for instance, on the circular economy, right? So the return logistics. So the scenarios that I mentioned here, and you can read them as well. We focus on a higher peak by the end of the year, what the impact of that will be, are probable scenarios in our case, and then also the implication is also mentioned there as well. Now, if we also have then a few unforeseen events, those are the ones that we really need to take into account, like the black swan events, or the ones where we say like, hey, these might even happen as well, right? And here we're talking more about border closings or lockdowns, intensified trade wars, and for instance, another ever given blocking the Suez Canal, or in airport cyber attack, system hack, etc. So events that are not extremely likely to happen, but if they do happen, the implication of that, and that's also the implication that we mentioned there, is going to be very big, right? So do we need to, are they very probable that they will take place? Probably not as probable as the other scenarios, but if they happen, the implication is very big. And I've actually also run a poll on LinkedIn on this one, asking the audience or the community on LinkedIn about this, and I was surprised by the amount of people that actually still take into account another ever given that is going to happen. It was 50% of the people actually are still assuming that one of those scenarios can happen and are preparing for that. I like that. It's really good, because that means that a lot of us are getting more prepared for the future. I think that's good. Willem, maybe to you. You talked already a little bit about reshoring and nearshoring,
Yeah.
right? So these intensified trade wars. And you mentioned also specific commodities or industries for that.
Yeah. So I already did some of the info earlier on, but kind of it is quite interesting. We see in our daily practice in working for kind of medium and Fortune 500 companies, that they're kind of asking us to re-evaluate their manufacturing footprint.
Yeah.
Um, and we said already the drivers, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Green Deal with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also kind of the ability to create smart factories makes the cost delta kind of different than it used to be. Because a lot was based on labor arbitrage, but if you are able to build smart factories, that plays less of a role. So that's why we actually see that, and it is, and that's also interesting in terms of the scenario discussion. You have obviously the complete reshoring discussion, or you have the China plus one strategy discussion, which is sort of, can we, next to China, keep in the Far East, for example, another manufacturing hubs, set that up, so that we are more resilient. We recently also published something in that in the Wall Street Journal, and the risk in that is you need to think it through properly, because if the primary inputs still come out of China, and then kind of the processing of that then happens in another Asian country, then in essence, if something happens with a blockade or some event, you're still kind of in trouble because that key input still coming out of China. So it's about kind of reshoring, nearshoring, but also the China plus one strategy that's playing there.
All right, and friendshoring is another term that I've heard recently as well, right? So
Yeah,
there's more scenarios or strategies also mentioned right, in this typical field. I do have to admit that over the last, I think 5 years, 6 years, the topic of nearshoring has been always on also these kind of webinars or conferences, etc.
yeah.
Do you think that we're making a pivotal shift right now? Is it really? Are we
Well,
getting? Is it?
I agree with you. It has been a sort of on and off on the radar for decades. Sort of the ever promise of reshoring. And it's always when people respond in surveys and research, it's always hard to kind of judge what that really means in terms of short-term action, but kind of with the fact that we actually do the project work on that means it is serious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I would. We do hear it more, and we also hear that more companies are doing this. And maybe also a good example is I read an article in Forbes, I think, where a large AirPod producer actually saw that all of their suppliers were actually trying to get as fast as possible from China into Vietnam, and we're all trying to secure manufacturing locations, etc. So it was a little bit of a rat race to see like who could still secure a good spot and a place and a good plant and good manufacturing facilities and infrastructure in the different markets. So the China plus one. So you all of a sudden saw everyone moving there on that China plus one strategy. And that's actually is a nice bridge with those scenarios where we say like, okay, so if those scenarios are happening, then it's important to see like how do we need to respond rapidly to it, right? So in this case, we saw that that was actually happening. So fast response to unforeseen events or gradual events is definitely important. So you could actually you could put that into a matrix, and
Yeah,
we've done that
I
also.
interrupt one more
Yeah,
time, guys? I don't think
by
it
all
will be the
means.
last time of today, but just now the the advantage if you do the scenario planning and you determine kind of how you would respond in each of these scenarios were they to unfold, is
Yep.
that you can also combine that with a concept we call that strategic flexibility, and basically you already take some actions with sort of little risk, little cost involved, but that already prepare you for kind of unfolding of certain scenarios. So in this case, in this example that you gave, if you had this on the radar for a long time and you said kind of, well, if I need to respond, I actually need to already do some preparatory work. Kind of the risk is that kind of I will only use it 5 years later, but that's the whole risk. So let me already do the preparatory work, look for spots, suppliers, etc. And then you're really kind of responding much faster than others that have maybe their playbook ready, but they still have to start from page
Very
zero.
interesting. Yeah. So it's a good call out. So thanks for interrupting me there. So this is actually the strategic flexibilities. That's actually the experimentation that's taking place, right? So you do need to experiment a little bit already, see what works, what doesn't work, so that if you do, and that probably increases your rapid response time as
Yeah,
well, right?
yeah.
Interesting. All right. Hey, we've plotted those different scenarios, and I think this is a good exercise to do as well. On the one hand, like, hey, what is that required response time, and on the other hand, sort of, what is my ability to actually control my logistics cost? So like, so what you try to do here is you try to visualize the different scenarios and see what the importance is of those different scenarios and how and what the impact is on your organization. So needless to say, if the situation is pretty predictable, it's very easy to control your cost, right? So if you see right now that there's not a lot of bottlenecks because capacity is pretty wide and there's not a lot of issues there, then you can very easily control your cost. As soon as you go more into the scenarios which are a little bit more unforeseen, then obviously the chances that you need to come up with other solutions which are not really well prepared, the chances that that the ability to control your cost are low or easy, they reduce drastically. In other words, you will lose your control over your logistics cost. So there's an interesting way of how to look at that. There's obviously a correlation between the two in terms of, the scenario and how fast you need to respond, and your ability to control cost. But it's a good way. And then I would say, like, introduce the stories that Willem just talked about to that as well. And that's a very solid starting point, I would say, for coming up with your supply chain strategy. Anything to add there, Willem, from your side?
Well, yeah. These are more sort of the uncertainties, but you need to
Yeah.
combine multiple together to get sort of meaningful scenarios. So you could say, just an example, if you say for the two dimensions, sort of kind of how open will our borders be, and how fast is kind of digitization enabling sort of highly automated manufacturing, how is that going? And then you could say, from the one area, kind of, we have open borders and stagnating digitization. You have sort of, you could call it the global golden era for freight. On the other hand, if you say, I have still open borders, but I have a lot of digitization, and you can say I have a reshoring acceleration. And so that's sort of how you combine these factors, and then create a quote unquote story of how that would be.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's a good call out. So the combination is important, right? That's
Yeah.
what you're actually saying. Looking at those different sources. Yeah. No, I would 100% agree to that. I have a good example then of a scenario scorecard in a minute. But first, if we look at this, and if we look at, hey, it's all about rapid response time is
Oh, and
important.
can I give a sort of, can I intersect on the previous page?
Yeah.
Because one of the interesting elements that you highlight on the previous page is obviously ESG.
Yeah.
So when sort of reporting scope 3 emissions, and if there is a shift in sort of the amount of attention companies get when they have high emissions in scope 3, that could actually be a trigger to do much more data-driven insights and to see what are your quick wins by changing sort of carriers and modes, etc. How you can sort of optimize your scope 3 emissions, and then also calculate different options of depending on the level of cost and speed. You can actually absorb and changing these emissions, but it does require you for every shipment, every leg of your journey, that you understand emissions and be able to kind of run alternative options there.
Yeah, yeah. No, so and I actually we are seeing an increasing interest in this topic as well, and making sure that that's fully understood. So ESG, for those of you who don't know, so environmental, social, and governance is turning into a very important topic where there's a lot of room for improvement on actually making sure that we make that visible and understandable for everyone. Good call out.
Yeah, and also sort of one final thing, otherwise, is kind of the whole concept that under the European regulations, you need to have the insight in who are your the supplier behind your supplier, etc. And that analysis might also uncover sort of kind of issues that you then need to respond quickly to.
Yeah, that's an extremely relevant topic. And in Germany, it's called the Lieferketten.
Beautiful.
Yes, exactly. Okay, um, going into the rapid response right now. So actually, we concluded that being able to respond rapidly to unpredictable scenarios is going to be extremely important. Not for every company, obviously. So you need to assess how important that is. But if you look at the elements of rapid response, then we have we've come up with a few elements that we believe are extremely important. On the next slide, you can we put them all together. So on the first part, you need to make sure that you have high level of data, right? And that data needs to have a high level of granularity, right? So a lot of detail. The more details, the better you understand what's going on, and you can make decisions. So that's at the top of the data circle. Then it's not only the granularity which is important, but actually the data needs to be of extremely high quality. If you need to spend an awful lot of time on actually making sure that the data is correct and cleaning the data, then you lose a lot of precious time, which is in rapid response not really useful. So high level of data, good quality data. The third one is historical data. If you want to spot trends, if you want to see is this normal or not, it makes sense that you have data going back to actually make sure that you can make those decisions based on more than a couple of data points. So that's the data side of it. If you want to make changes, then it's obviously very important to have robust processes in place. If you want to shift if you want to shift from one mode to the other or from one country to the other, right? And your logistics and your supply chain setup is based on 10 years doing the same thing, flying from Xiamen to Frankfurt, and you all of a sudden need to change that, you don't have a robust process for it, creates only more chaos. And that's why you were referring to, Willem, in the strategic flexibility that you need to have. You need to test that to a certain extent, because otherwise you run the risk that the decision that you make is actually going to create more chaos than you had before. Robust processes. Then the other part of the process is you should not only have that visibility, but you also need to see, like what operational actions are actually, the operational actions need to be centrally visible for everyone. Everyone needs to understand who is doing what. That's the only way how you can respond rapidly, right? So it's not like I understand what's going on and I'm going to take actions left and right in a very, let's say, siloed way. But it's important to centralize and keep those processes all together. Last but not least, we should focus on the end-to-end optimization, right? Obviously, an integration of that. Because if you take only action on one part of that, then you might find yourself having bottlenecks in other parts of the organization.
Yeah.
If you add people to this who can actually manage this and who can actually think of creative solutions, then you have a very good model to actually make sure that you can respond rapidly to what you see happening in the market. Willem, I hope you can echo this, or at least.
Yeah, well, we see, and we do a lot of work. We call it very nicely digital twin work, where you create a digital version of your entire supply chain, enabling you to make sort of very operational decisions, tactical decisions, but also strategic decisions, and indeed sort of getting the right data in feed in there and the right quality. That is vital for being able to run a digital twin.
Yeah, it's a digital twin work. That's an interesting that's an interesting approach, I would say.
Yeah.
Um, all right, then The last thing before we round this off, now we want to put this all together. So what we've done is we've showed to you what are the uncertainties that you need to take into account. How do you translate that in, let's say, also some short-term scenarios? You need to look at the different probabilities of what you see happening, and then you can put that all together actually in a scorecard, if you will, or in an investment case, where you actually, like look at the combined scenarios, what the probability is that those are going to happen, and what the impact is of what you see actually going on there. So um, you could say like the probability of scenario A is relatively high. That means that cost control will not be very difficult for me because it's a situation which is relatively manageable. Service level is easy to keep up high because there's not a lot of operational hiccups there or whatever. And so the need for me to rapidly respond to what we see happening in the market is relatively low. So there's not really a need to further invest. But if you look, for instance, at that ESG model, then it's completely different, right? So the probability that it becomes more important for all kind of companies is definitely there. There's a lot of uncertainties there on how we do that, on what we need to do exactly. So the ability to control cost is not as easy as it is, for instance, for that first scenario, right? The service level is still can still be high, and the response rate can be is relatively low. So what you do is you try to make some sort of a scorecard of all of the different scenarios, and then see like, okay, if I look at the probability of this happening, what is the impact of this? What is the story behind it? And do I need to invest or do I need to change something going forward? And this will allow you actually also to share that with other stakeholders in your organization to make sure that you say like, listen, we need to change something. There is some form of transformation is important here. I think that's a little bit the summary of what we wanted to discuss today. Did I forget something, Willem?
No, I think we covered everything that we scripted ourselves for, and a bit beyond.
Very good.
Um, and things are not getting easier in some cases, because if you look at the future of the supply chain, um, there's a lot of talk about a segmented supply chain focused on customer centricity. So you actually differentiate your supply chain for specific product groups or customer segments, uh, which requires you to approach your supply chain not as sort of one big homogeneous thing, but actually a kind of a layered one, which even makes the data importance more important.
Yeah, no. So the data element will even become more important
Yeah.
on this one as well. I think a last one, if you're determining your supply chain strategy, you should also determine what is the game that I want to play with my supply chain. Do I want to dominate? Do I want to make sure that my company or my product has a top-notch supply chain, so the product delivery and whenever my product comes to the market is going to be the best out there. So I want to dominate. I want to have a supply chain where I really want to make sure I have the best. Or do you want to differentiate? Do you want to say like the only thing I need to do is be slightly better than our competition? That's what I want. Or do you say like I need to be at par? I need to be not worse than my competition, but also not necessary to be better. So dominate, differentiate, or play at par is something that you need to assess up front when you determine what your supply chain strategy and decisions are going to be. All right. I see that we're already talking for 50 minutes, Willem. So that was a good and engaging discussions. If anyone has questions, then obviously feel free to share them with us. I see a few already, and the first one that I would like to also discuss here
Yeah.
is how has the pandemic impacted scenario planning for companies and what new challenges have emerged? Um, I don't know
Well,
Willem, if you have already.
in that sense, the level of attention and rigor that companies put into scenario planning, and we also see that from the number of assignments in that area has made a step change. Um, so I think that is kind of an important response to that.
Yeah. So you're saying like it actually, the fact that we saw a lot more unpredictable, unforeseen events
Yeah,
actually triggered a little bit the necessity for scenario
yeah,
planning.
yeah.
Yeah.
And in the years before that, there were obviously there was more the digital disruption. That's kind of, if you were not paying attention, you could be out of business in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So that was the driver, also a big driver of scenario planning. And now the pandemic kind of um, got also kind of another kind of big push towards scenario planning.
Yeah. I think one other thing that I'd like to mention there is the pandemic and all of the unforeseen scenarios that we have seen over the last years have actually, um, like what that has triggered is we've seen the impact of not having a good supply chain or having everything well prepared. You have seen the impact of that in real life. You've seen how you were able to respond to it, so you know how your company is actually currently able to weather the storm. So it's the examples are extremely vivid and still alive because they happened very recently, and you should use that to say like, how was I actually able to respond when a big vessel blocked the Suez Canal? So you can make it even more engaging, so the necessity is there or the need is there, and you can make it more realistic by using the examples that we've seen over the last period.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, conscious of time, but I still want to take this question. So, and you answered that already a little bit, but how do you see the field of scenario planning evolving in the future, and what new trends and technologies are emerging that will impact this area? And I think you
Yeah.
mentioned already about the tooling, right, or specifically about how you can better track that. Is there any
Yeah.
other things that you could mention?
Um, the well, I think we spoke at length already. I think so the tooling is both for the scenario development, where you're able to process enormous amounts of information with AI to actually start generating different drivers and combine them into scenario in combination with the traditional craftsman work.
Yeah,
Um, and the, the tooling to kind of, we call it kenosis, but then kind of the ability to track automatically how your indicators for a certain scenario are developing over time gives you much more sort of upfront awareness of what is happening, and so that is really special. And now you see the combination with sort of autonomous decision making, that you actually kind of use the data, use the insights, um, to actually make a kind of decisions autonomously, where when they need to be made, can be made, and in a fast way.
yeah. So autonomous decision making, that is 100% contributing to rapid response, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting development
Yeah,
there.
and the interesting part is, but the kind of, when making decisions, you need to have visibility on this entire supply chain, right? Because
Yes.
a flow might be disrupted, but you have enough stock, so it doesn't really matter. Um, and there could be other flows where it really matters, and then you can make trade-off, kind of where you put your additional dollars or euros in to speed up, and maybe you can slow down some of the other elements that you still have in stock. You, you actually need to optimize uh, for the profit or customer availability of the product, and that drives your decision making. But that requires kind of a couple of steps further from having in the real insight into availability, profit levels per product, etc.
Yeah, yeah, and even a little bit, like closer, or at least even more shorter term influences on scenarios. What we're looking at, and we're constantly trying to develop, is not only offering our customers an option to go how goods need to be transferred from A to B, but at the same time also offering them other solutions. Obviously, that's what we do already. In the ideal world, we use also this machine learning, where we say, like, um, if we look at the weather conditions right now in a specific area, we do actually believe that there's a chance that there will be a delay or whatsoever, so that we start using also these tools to predict and to actually inform our customers about the different scenarios, and why can we do that, or why do we think that this is interesting, because we have a lot of that data right now that allows us to actually build those models. So
Yeah.
I think that from a scenario planning perspective, whether that's on a very short term or very, near future kind of scenario, but also on the very long term ones, I think we're only at the beginning of it when you look at the data and the tools that we can use to further optimize this. So this is going to be bread and butter in the future. I think that's definitely something, some scenario that I would predict is going to happen.
Okay. That's a nice closing, Matthias.
Thank you. I think, yeah, from a timing perspective, we're also there. Thank you very much for your insights. For the audience, thank you for your interest in this webinar. I hope you found it interesting to listen to us. I enjoyed it a lot, Willem. So thanks for the
Yeah.
for the conversation here. Um, if you would like to know more, right, there's also possibilities to schedule a demo with Flexport, right? You can click on the button below, and someone from our team will reach out to you. We will drop also a copy of the slide deck in the chat, and we will email everyone a link to the recording and the slides tomorrow morning. On that demo one, we are doing an upcoming webinar on demo on March 3rd, where we will show a little bit, like how, for those of you who don't know our platform and what you can do with it and how you can use it in building those scenarios. That might be a good opportunity to join. So with this, thank you very much, Willem, for joining again.
Yeah. My
And
pleasure.
yeah, I look forward to speak to all of you in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you.